Okay. All right. So, Hadassah, or Esther, as her Greek name would be. So, but her Hebrew name is Hadassah. And we get a lot of, if you got the background pages, if you don't, I'll just briefly give a little bit of background on the story, and then we'll dive into the text itself and some questions around the text. So, the book of Esther is, we find it in two different languages in the Bible, in the Catholic Bible and in the Protestant Bible. So there's a Greek version of Esther and there's a Hebrew version of Esther, and they are not the same. One's a little longer than the other and has some more details than the other. Essentially, the story is the same, but there are some details that one highlights over the other. And don't ask me what they all are in this moment. Now, some interesting things. Esther does not mention the name of God in the Hebrew. I think that's true. And in the Greek it does. More of an overt mention. But in the Qumran discoveries of the biblical scrolls there in that Essene community, they have not yet found Esther. They think they find fragments of Esther, but it's the only book of the Old Testament that they don't actually have record of as being a part of that Qumran society. I'm sure it's there somewhere in a cave in the desert, but it is kind of interesting that it wasn't with the rest. I mean, it could have disintegrated, who knows. But, so we have in this story a book of wisdom. And so books of wisdom, I would say in general, are not, there are people who definitely read them literally, but they're meant to also show a story and tell something to the people, or a question of life, a way of seeing life. You're going to see that a lot in the book of Ecclesiastes and in Proverbs, different ways of being or challenging. Next week in the book of Job, is Job an actual person, or is Job more of a embodiment of a question of life? Why do people suffer? Why do people who are good suffer? Where is God in suffering? So, but that's next week, primer for next. So what we'll do is start a little bit with, one of the reasons why I say that Esther is probably more of a symbolic story is it's really hard to pin down the history. Is this King Xerxes of Persia? Is this King Artaxerxes? Is it Ashur-hazes? There's no mention of Queen Esther anywhere in this empire's writings, but that doesn't mean that she didn't exist. It just means that the same goes through with the with Haman and the pogrom, or the genocide. It's just there's no record of this anywhere. It doesn't mean, again, it didn't happen. Clearly there are many accounts of the Jewish people being attacked and threatened with genocide. But out of this comes the festival or celebration of Purim. And Purim is a celebration or festival of lots. That name comes from the casting of lots, which you have read about in the earlier books we've read. If you remember, lots are cast to determine what an outcome should be. It's really a roll of the dice is what we might call it, and our fate. So the name, at least from Esther, comes from the fact that Haman casts lots to determine when he is going to carry out this diabolical plot against the Jewish people in the kingdom. So that's where we get the Jewish celebration of Purim, but as you may have read from the notes, it's actually an Akkadian celebration or festival that the Jewish people borrowed, like we borrow Christmas from the Romans. Does everybody follow that? Did I lose you? You sure? I'm happy. Great. All right, because I can dive into that if we want. But okay, so that's basically the background of the story. And So let's get into some of the questions I sent as we talk first about the main characters of the story. And so we have, to start off, we have King Ashur-hazes or Xerxes. And he's having a big blowout week-long celebration. We have Queen Vashti, who is celebrating, presumably he's outdoors with this lavish party on the grounds, and she's in the palace holding a girls-only time. And at some point during the festivities, he, wanting to display his basically trophy wife, tells her to come dressed to the nines so he can show her off, and she says no. And so he calls in his great advisors, and they're all up in arms, because if this queen can do this, then pretty soon every man in the kingdom's going to have trouble with their wives, and we can't have that because the guy is the head of the household. So there's much wringing of the hands, and we have to do something, and they agree that she must be deposed of her throne. And then we have this, again, very kind of almost Disney-like search for the glass slipper, a search for the one who will become the future queen. But it doesn't really say that. I mean, we kind of celebrate it that way. VeggieTales does a movie about this story, but really it's, these women are all given a test run in the king's harem. So it's really not as glamorous, perhaps, for the ladies as, I mean, they are in the palace, but, so a chance to, I likened it in the notes to a biblical bachelor. You know, do you get a rose this week or not? And so we know then that Hadassah, or Esther, I'll use Esther from now on, is being raised by her uncle Mordecai. He is a well-respected leader in the Jewish community. He takes Esther to try out for the pageant. She's beautified for, I think, what is it, a year or 18 months. It's a long time of these beautification products. And she catches the king's eye. So Esther is in the king's court as a finalist for Miss Ashur-hazes, Miss Universe, Miss Ashur-hazes, Miss Persia. But she hasn't told anybody that she's Jewish. All right? Her identity is hidden as far as her faith. Okay, so bringing this kind of to today, have you ever found a time when it's tempting to hide something about yourself in the public sphere or with friends or family? And if so, well, when do you find that? You can speak in generalities, or when has that been an experience with you when you've been afraid to reveal something about yourself for fear of potential repercussions? Maybe that has never happened to you. I kind of doubt it. So anybody, I mean, we just talked about kids in high school.
Oh my gosh, living in Westmont and going to Hinsdale Central. I mean, it was like that when I went there, because I lived in Westmont, went to Central. It's like that now. You know, what junior high did you go to? Please don't make me say it. And it's still very much a big
Yeah, on
thing.
the different side of the tracks.
Yes, big time. So yeah, that's a hard one.
Yep, that's one example. Any others that you think about that you'd be willing to talk about or share? Or maybe we don't want to share it here because we're afraid of being on camera or anything else. Yeah.
Well, I think too it could be in a situation where you're a new employee at a company and people are sitting around talking about where they went to college or university, and maybe you went to some podunk school or something that you've never heard of, and everybody else went to Big Ten or the Ivy League schools or something like that. So even though you're somewhat equal in stature with your job and your titles and your responsibilities, these people have these much higher educations that make them set aside for
WIU.
That's
Yeah.
a good, yeah. That's a great example. If you have some underlying health conditions and you're applying for something, you might be hesitant to say that you have this or that because of a job opportunity or a health opportunity. you might, on the converse, regret having posted some things about yourself on social media that an employer would be looking at. It could be around the Thanksgiving table with family and somebody delves into politics or religion and you think, oh boy, Aunt so-and-so is going to fight with Uncle so-and-so or cousin so-and-so. So yeah, there's a vulnerability there. And this hiddenness and then revealing of herself is going to be, we all see it in the story, right? Kind of like a Shakespeare play. We know who Esther is, we know who Mordecai is, but Haman doesn't, and neither does the king. And it's going to be this, you think, Haman thinks one thing's going to happen, he's going to get, who should I honor, who should I put on, put him on the best horse, take him through town, lavish him publicly. Yeah, do that for Mordecai when he thinks it's going to be for him. So there's all these clever plays on what you think's going to happen, at least the characters in the story, and what does. Okay. Who do you struggle with, or what characters stood out to you individually in this text?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Why would Mordecai want her to do that?
It's a great question. What were your reactions to that make you ask the question?
Well, because she was intermarrying, which was not allowed. I don't know. I don't know. It was just a question. Why did he do that?
That's a
Did he
great
want
question.
power?
The question is why? Yeah, is
his
he?
way of getting power? I don't know.
We don't know what their financial situation is, or what their, is this a huge opportunity for a step up, or does Mordecai, at some sense, hope that at some point there'll be more recognition for his people because he is a leader in his people, and maybe he is a bit of a schemer in having, has an alternative motive to have his niece do this, because maybe it is a chance then for his people to be recognized in a way they haven't.
Or at the very least protected from a plot.
Yeah, maybe.
Well, and he's basically like caring for her, so if she's living at the palace, he no longer is providing for her.
Yeah, so
Right.
it could be a very, based on the other things we know about Mordecai's personality, he seems to be upfront, honest, fair, just person. So I don't think he's, trying to dodge paying the bills.
No,
for
but
his,
he could
but he
still
could be.
It would be caring for her, making
Sure.
sure she has a place, if
Sure.
she's not married and like doing that whole thing where you have your land or whatever. It would be a place to
Yeah.
put her where she was being
Yeah.
fed and home housed.
So-
Did he know Haman? I mean, did they know that when he had her try out for this, did he know this was going to happen for the Jewish people? Or
No. Not yet.
Yeah, so if he didn't, he didn't do it with an intent from that perspective at that point.
Yeah, he doesn't seem to have any sense that it's, there's a
Because
chance.
he hears it, this is going to happen. Now this is what you have to do, Esther.
Although
You could die.
what we
if you
do
don't.
know is that he won't bow down to Haman, and I'm sure he knows that Haman doesn't like him. So maybe he feels there's some kind of threat there. It's we don't know. It doesn't say. So it's a great question. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
have a question.
Yeah.
Do you think that, I know that the king would have been upset that because now his wife could be killed, being Jewish, but do you think he was equally upset because she was Jewish?
Oh, no, that's a great question. He doesn't. He seems to continue to respond positively to Esther. He grants her request, which he doesn't have to do. He could just say, "Wow, you lied to me. Sorry. I'm going to include you in this genocide, because you're part of the problem that Haman's pointed out to me." So I would say it seems like it's actually the opposite, that Esther has laid this groundwork of relationship with him. He values her. I don't know if he loves her, but he values her. He says he's going to give her up to half the kingdom, so he is driven to please her for whatever reason that could be. Yeah, he seems to respect her beyond her Jewishness, and in spite of or because of it, there's not a consequence of that, which is a pretty good observation, because certainly in history that wouldn't be true in a lot of places. And we also read, I'm glad you brought that up, Jennifer, because we read that it's King Cyrus of Persia that eventually Isaiah says God uses as an instrument to return the people to Jerusalem and to rebuild. You read about it in Nehemiah and Ezra. So the idea that the Persians were pretty open to the Jewish people in ways that other cultures had not been, and continue not to be later. Yeah, great observation, and great question. Other characters that you think, or you thought really stood out to you before we jump into the text more?
The king was useless. Like, he didn't make any decisions for himself. He didn't stand for anything. He was just...
Yeah, kings sometimes are useless. Yeah, he's a very passive character, pretty much throughout. Yeah, I would say the king, he's forgetful, doesn't follow through, he's kind of wishy-washy. So yeah, that's a great observation. Anybody else feel that way about King Ashur-hazes? Now, if this is really King Xerxes in history, that's not the picture of him that we get in history. A very strong king and quite a conqueror, a very strong Persian king. But at least in this story, he's kind of a dupe. Yeah. Okay. Then let's get back into the text itself in Esther. So we have, if you'll turn with me into Esther, we have the situation where Esther has become the recipient kind of the beauty pageant. She has found the king's favor, but she's only allowed the women of the harem, the queen hasn't been selected yet, can only go to the king when it's their night. And so to go to the king otherwise, I don't know if she's too clingy or what, but the king has the authority to kill her or to remove her. Killing's worst threat, but none of it's going to be good. Basically, I'm going to throw away my shot if I go and visit the king without invitation. In the background of that, we have the buildup of the antagonist here in Haman. And Haman is slighted because Mordecai won't kneel and pay homage to him, respect his office as the right. Haman's a kiss-up, a brown-noser, a bootlicker, whatever you want to call him, very obsequious. He smooches up to the king because he wants more and more power, right? And so because somebody doesn't recognize his power, he finds out he's a Jewish person, and because he hates Mordecai, he not only wants to punish Mordecai, but he makes a sweeping statement about all Jewish people in the kingdom. They all got to go. So let me ask you this. That seems extreme, but if you have a negative interaction with somebody of a different culture or a different race, does that fuel prejudice?
I think sometimes it does.
It
Could?
could.
I'll give an example. My sister is very big in anti-puppy mill stuff, and a lot of Amish people have puppy mills. According to her, if you're Amish, you have a puppy mill, and that's it. You're a bad person. She doesn't like the Amish.
Yeah.
And half our relatives are Mennonites, so I
Yeah.
don't know. I'm like, seriously,
So it makes it
you
a
can't
little
hate all the
tricky.
Amish because some of them have puppy mills.
Yeah, so...
But sometimes it does. It just carries.
Yeah, sometimes personal experience can cause us to broad brushstroke not always, but broad brushstrokes, whole groups of people, and that's
She
what.
hasn't ever tried to kill all the Amish.
Well, that's good. Thankfully. Yeah, but that's definitely true in this story. Yeah, definitely true in this story. And so Haman goes to the king and hatches this plot, cast lots, Purim, for the destruction of the Jewish people. And then Mordecai catches wind of it, and he's going to go to Esther, send her a letter to do something, to use her influence to do something. But before we get there, there's something else that Mordecai does. Does everybody remember this part of the story? What is
The stake? The stake?
the stake?
He has the stake built to impale Mordecai on?
Oh, a gallows or a pike, yeah, that's Haman, yeah. But Mordecai,
Haman, okay, sorry.
Mordecai discovers something else. He overhears something else. Does anybody remember?
The king was going to be
The
killed.
plot to
An
kill-
assassination
the
plot.
assassination
Yeah.
plot.
So he tells the king that his guards are going to assassinate him. And then the king takes care of Big Thana and the other guard, whose name always escapes me. And then forgets to thank or appreciate Mordecai. So king, again, an example of the king kind of being off. King's laying up in bed, can't go to sleep, rings the king's records, because what else is going to put you to sleep other than the king's records? And
That was a good choice for that. After
Yeah.
us reading Chronicles?
and yeah, come on here, come on in, Rose, come on in, we got a chair for you. So the king gets up, like eyes open, kind of in the middle of the night. Oh my gosh, I forgot. Did you ever have that where you forget to do something? And I got to get to this. I've got to recognize this guy. And then we have that kind of humorous moment, well, for us as the readers or hearers of the story. And this is when this story is told. We're going to do this, by the way. We're going to celebrate Purim in fall. It's a spring holiday. But we're going to celebrate it around Halloween. Because in Judaism, if you're celebrating Purim, you dress up in costumes. Why? It's kind of like the Jewish Halloween, because you're pretending to be, on the surface, somebody that is different than who you are. Esther's pretending or hiding her identity as a Jew. And then she's going to reveal that. But it might surprise you, because this story is about a genocide, or attempted genocide. And it is a very happy, joyful celebration in Judaism. It's, of all the festivals, it's the most happy festival in the Jewish calendar year. And you might say, well, what the heck? Why is that? They use noisemakers and boos and hisses when Haman's introduced, and they read the story. Get him out of here. And children have noisemakers, and they just have a big, because it's really celebrating the reversal of fortune. When things seem darkest, God, there's instruments of people. When people step forward and do the right thing, things can change. One person can make a huge difference. It has a ripple effect on everything. There's a lot of celebration in remembering the festival of Purim. And it's a very happy festival, but then you read the backstory and you're like, well, this doesn't seem like a very happy story, at least initially. And there's a lot of intention of bloodshed and brutality, and then, yeah, it kind of works out in the end, except for Haman and his sons. But, the bad guy gets killed in the end, and everybody rides off in the sunset, kind of thing. But
A lot of other people get killed too. It's kind of just seemed like the opposite happened, and that's not good either.
when you're saying the Jewish people defended themselves and
They
they
didn't
killed
just defend
killed like
themselves.
70,000.
They killed.
So let's talk about that. There's pretty strong evidence, I would argue, that that's added to the book of Esther later. That it actually ends with the decree that they can defend themselves in chapter 8, but that chapter 9, in this retaliatory strike, both the Hebrew, the way the Hebrew's written, the style of it doesn't match the first 8 chapters. So I would argue that, I'd be one, not everybody agrees with this, but I would definitely argue that there's some finagling of the text to say, don't mess with us, because we can defend ourselves. Not only that, but grab the cat by the tail and we might scratch you, kind of thing. So don't do these kind of things to us as a people. But in actuality, I think the original text ends with they're given the opportunity to defend themselves. The attack really doesn't happen. If it does, it's sporadic and people are okay. And then because of all that, it ends in peace and everybody's happy and celebrating. You're going to read about this in the book of Job too. The book of Job, Pastor Michelle will talk about it next week. And I'm just going to highlight it here just because I brought it up. Shame on me. But in the book of Job, Job loses his kids, and his wife says, why don't you just renounce your faith and die already? He's got all these sores, and he loses his camels and his sheep and his donkeys. His house collapses. And at the end of the story, he's, asking God, I didn't do anything to deserve this, and come down here and meet me. And God says, okay. And God says, hey, listen, you're a person, I'm God. There's a lot of things in this life you're not going to understand. And God goes through this litany, this kind of soliloquy, this monologue of all the reasons why Job is too insignificant or small to fully grasp everything in the universe that he's asking about. And then, at the end of the book, Job gets double the donkeys, double the sheep, double the camels. He gets a new wife, he gets new kids, and everything's great again. Well, in fact, it's even better than it was before. And it's kind of thank goodness Job suffered, but he's going to be doubly blessed. Well, there's strong argument that ending to the book of Job was lobbed on there to make it feel like, okay, it wouldn't feel as good if this guy ends this question or asks this question to God, and God says, hey, you're really not going to get it all in this life. Curtain falls, and that's it. So I can't have an ending like that. That's too much of a cliffhanger. That doesn't sit very well because it's an unanswered question. So let's make everything good. Much in the same way that Mark's gospel, when we do the New Testament, ends with the women running away scared from the tomb and it's empty, and then some later endings say, and then Jesus appeared to all these people, and then the women told people, and then they were handling snakes, and everybody was okay, and it was great, and Jesus was there. Instead of, they're running away terrified because the tomb is empty. Now what are you going to do with this? So I'm going on a tangent. That's all a long-winded way of me saying that I don't think that's the original ending of Esther. You can do with that what you like. You could say, Pastor Scott has no idea what he's talking about. And we like our chapter 9 and 10. But, it ties it up in a nice little bow. All right, back to the text itself. So, probably the most famous part of this time, of this text, is 3:14. At first, Esther is saying, she gets a letter from Mordecai saying, you've got to do something. You've got the king's ear, the king's attention, whether it's his ear or whatever. You've got to talk to him. Find a way to tell him to stop this because you have power. You're in this position. And she says, no, I can't do it. It's too big a risk. I got it pretty nice here in the palace. And he says, hey, this is going to affect you. Don't think the palace is going to, eventually you're going to be found out. So let me ask you this. What kind of things do you think about in our own lives that kind of center around you have a choice to stick your neck out or to say something when something's not right, or you can play it safe and hide behind your position or your comfort or the walls of the castle or behind a powerful figure in your life like a king and not worry about it. Does that resonate with you at all in your own life experiences or your wider faith journey?
You're telling me to say
Well,
something.
not everybody at once. Come on.
Just
I
gotta
think
let it sit
anytime
there.
that you need to stick up for anybody, whether it's sticking up for someone, you know, that's being bullied, or a group of people that's being marginalized, or people who are struggling and need assistance. I think it happens all the time.
Hmm. Yeah, and is there a cost to that?
There can be,
Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes parents have to stick up for their children
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
when they feel that their children are not being wronged, but not not being treated unfairly in situations. I mean, I had a situation with my son. Well, my husband stuck up for him, but my oldest son loved baseball. That's all he ever did when he had free time. And he decided to, join a baseball team. Of course, my husband was a soccer player, so that wasn't too great for him. But nevertheless, we went to the games, but he never got to play.
Mm-hmm.
Every time we went to a game, he'd cry, come home and say, I never get to play. I'm sitting on the bench. So my husband finally spoke to the coach, and he allowed him to play. And he played very well, and he made the all-star team. And the coach said, oh, I didn't know your son could play that well. Well, guess what? If you didn't give him a chance,
Right,
how would
yeah.
you find out?
Sure. Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
sometimes we do have to stick up for our children.
Absolutely.
I have family members that like to make fun of certain groups of people. They think it's very funny.
Mm-hmm.
And so, of course, kind of in a nice way, let them know. But it continues to happen, and so you can't constantly,
Yeah.
stamp your foot and walk out and, make a scene every time.
Mhm.
So it's,
Yeah.
It's uncomfortable.
it
though.
is, it's very uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I knew I had to prepare because I visited a best friend in San Diego. And yes, I came home Sunday. But Friday night we were at Petco Park in San Diego, and she's been my friend for 52 years since college.
Long time.
And I knew we had different political views, and so I just stayed away from that. And we did. We stayed away from that. But she made some comments about all the homeless people around Petco Park. It's kind of a tent city around there. And it's a beautiful library, and it's kind of hard to get to the library, and then all these high rises, and then the baseball. And she made some comment about, well, why can't they get a job or something like that, which, I bit my tongue for a while because she knew that I had worked with the coat drive and stuff here at my church. And, but then I couldn't take it. I did have to say a couple things. Many of these people have mental illness, and
Yeah.
there's no place for them to go, and
Yeah.
so I think she thought about it, what I said, and we just kind of dropped it then and went into the baseball field. But then coming home, it was a different feeling because their weather is good. So, they're living there 12 months a year and not inside. But yeah, I did stand up. I didn't want to get into a major fight, but I had a few words.
Sure.
We have, especially the instigator, we've had serious discussions about it, but the laugh seems to be more important. Getting the...
Yeah.
The repercussions that you were talking about, sometimes it's just socially, it's not acceptable to whatever, stick up for the, little guy or whatever. But I just remembered, during all the 2020 chaos, my kids were kind of at that age where they didn't quite understand it. They weren't doing a lot of the, new news or the current news or whatever. But all the Black Lives Matter stuff, and then all the anti-police and whatever. And I was trying to, kind of explain these things to them. And we went out and we decorated the sidewalks and did, things like justice and being fairness and everyone being treated, whatever. And then we also made a big poster that we brought to the police department that said, whatever, thank you, Westmont Police, whatever, for all you do, whatever. So we kind of looked at both sides and said both sides deserve to be valued and whatever. And I remember a friend of mine who actually, her husband is a police officer in Downers, and the Westmont Police Department had said, is it okay if we post the picture that we took of the kids with it? And the police officer said, do not do it. It could be dangerous. I mean, and it like I didn't even think of that, but things were weird then. Like it was getting creepy and scary and whatever. And you know, and then even now, like about, I don't even remember where it was, but the woman with the clothing store that had the flag, and
Yeah.
like it's getting to the point where it's not just, you know, I'm going to be embarrassed or I'm going to have like social repercussions and people think I'm whatever, a dork or, you know, whatever. It's some of those repercussions are a lot bigger and a
Right,
lot
yeah.
scarier.
Yeah, no, that's a good example. So, yeah, I mean, in this situation, I think in this wisdom book, we have that dynamic of family. All right, a family member has asked her to stick her neck out in faith and in a political way. It's going to be a political thing. She's going to challenge the king on something he has done. But he's also going to ask her to make her position or situation vulnerable. The possibility that she will lose everything she has gained. But he says, you know, this very famous line, it's the most famous line of the book. Who knows, perhaps you were put in this position for such as a time as this. And I always think about, you know, when you think about the book of Esther, I think about the times in our lives where we find ourselves in a situation we maybe didn't imagine where that situation would take us, or the ripple effects of that situation. I think about, for me individually, it was very reluctantly applying for the chaplaincy at the CPE, Clinical Pastoral Chaplaincy, when I was in seminary, because I hated hospitals. Did not want to be in the chaplaincy program, but anyway, ended up in there, and so many different interactions with families and situations, and the way that God was present in those moments, and the way it shaped me, and I think probably touched others. Yeah, that time such as this, that I couldn't have envisioned or understood where it would lead or how I would be in that as an instrument in those moments, or an opportunity to do something that might help others or change other circumstances. Much in the same way that Esther, you know, when she goes to be for the beauty in that beauty treatment, she's not thinking that she's going to be the voice piece to stop a genocide of her people, right? Not when she's getting her hair permed. And that's kind of this whole play of fortunes, and you know, you may think life is bad, or you may think you're not worth much, or you may think that you're this, and this is your routine, this is your daily. But then suddenly something is placed before you, and you have this crossroads. Do I play it safe? Do I cling to what I know? Do I stay in the boat from a couple Sundays ago? Or do I step out in faith? And do I risk because God is pulling me, or somebody is saying, I think God is, you're meant to use your gifts in this, and they're giving you a little nudge out of the nest. And I think that's very strong in our day-to-day lives in our faith. It could be a daily thing, right? Do I say something? Do I stay silent? Do I risk upsetting my friend? Do I make a public message about my support of X, Y, and Z? So Esther has those levels or layers of that wisdom and challenge of life. One of the reasons why it's a wisdom book is, you know, how does God work? How does God's, you know, I guess, you know, some Christians will say, particularly my Presbyterian friends and my Reformed friends, you know, God has a plan, and everything is predestined. You know, Esther's gonna do this. God planned it. God, the predestined folks would say, the strict Calvinists would say, Mordecai didn't really choose. God made the decision, and Mordecai was just, a pawn in the in the game of life, as Mongo would say from Blazing Saddles. He was just that instrument to put Esther in the situation that was going to play out this way. I don't necessarily believe that, but that's, layers of this choice, fate, destiny, whatever you want to call it, all kind of wrapped around that discussion of perhaps you were in this place for a time such as this. I think you get some deep waters around that. All right, so we have that. And then we have the Great British Bake Off, right? Esther decides she's going to cook for the king and invites Haman. Haman, by the way, goes home, rides by Mordecai, and Mordecai still, give him the cold shoulder, very aloof. He's stewing. Everything's great. Even the queen invited me to dinner. Moving on up to the big time. And yet there's still this guy. He's just can't wait to just mess with him. The king very next day, again, I say there's some frivolity to this story, because he comes in the very next day and the king's like saying, all right, what do I got to do? Because we see the discovery of the king's records and what Mordecai did. And so the king's coming in, I got to do this, I got to take care of Mordecai. But he doesn't name Mordecai. He says, what should I do for this person who's done so much for me? Well, and Haman thinks he's talking about himself. Well, you reach for the skies. I mean, really think big. You're thinking a small party, make it big. Get him the caddy, get him, deck it out, curb feelers, ground effects. Anyway, and then Haman's, all excited. And then he says, well, I need you to go get the horse because Mordecai is the guy. And then he goes home and people are like, uh-oh, this isn't good. You misread the room. This is going to not end well. And sure enough, second dinner comes. They're having the meal. Esther says, that guy is the one who created this whole thing. It's really a horrible, I'm Jewish, Haman wants me dead and all my people. And the king's very upset. King goes out into the veranda, out into the cool of the garden to cool off, to stew a little bit. And then we have this almost humorous situation. I mean, again, I say it's humorous, but it's not for Haman. He throws himself on the queen, who's on the couch. Doesn't look good when the king comes in. It's like a sitcom. What are you doing? Now you're going to rape the queen in my presence? Bad enough that you disturbed my dinner and bothered me with this terrible news, but now you're going to take advantage of my beautiful lady. I gotta say it. I just, part of me always wonders, the king is portrayed in some ways as being persuaded more by Esther's looks than by his wisdom. But anyway, thus his threat to Haman making advances. And it's really about her beauty, right, for the king, at least it seems on the surface. And then Haman is hanged by the very same gallows or pike that he intends for Mordecai. So it's almost like a Shakespeare play. It reminds me a little bit of Macbeth. There's this plot, the witches are, and there's no way the forests are going to move. That's ridiculous. And then Macbeth comes, and it's all over. So it's a rich story. It's told very colorfully, and I guess what I'd want to ask now is, why do you think, two things. Why do you think people struggled with it being put in the canon? Because it was a struggle for this book to be put in canon. And by that I mean, I'll reiterate, into the codification of the books that were going to become the Hebrew Bible. So, and then what strikes you as why so first, why is it controversial to put it in Scripture? And then why do you think, what lesson do we take from it? Or what lessons do you take from it as you read it? You said it was one of the easier books. It was pretty straightforward, short, thankfully.
I think that you have control. We can do good
God can do good out of the bad. From the bad, we can have a way, but we should be a part of it, not stand back and say, oh, no, not me. Somebody else should be doing that. That's a good idea, but I don't think not.
Yeah.
So for us to all be more involved in doing what is right and God's, then help us to make the good come from the evil stuff. That's it.
Yeah. Great point. Who wants to volunteer? And everybody takes a step back. Yeah, you have a choice to be an active agent and on God's behalf, or a light or hope in the world. Instead of alligator arming it, you can go out there and make a difference, and God could work through you. I think that's a great lesson to take from this book. Any others?
The Bible Project made a point of
Yeah.
God's name not being mentioned in the entire text,
Mhm.
because it is to show that even when things are going wrong and we don't see God, He is working in the background.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's did you all hear that point that Pam made, that even though God is not mentioned by name, perhaps the reason is that, or it is an example that God is still at work in people's lives. Faith is still pulling and tugging, and whether a person is seeing or acknowledging God strongly or not in the moment, God is still there. And pulling somebody to make the right decisions, to step forward, to stand up. That God's not off on some cloud, taking a fishing break. But God cares about what happens to people and outcomes in the world and what humanity is doing to each other. I think that's a great point as well. Anything else that you take from it?
What year historically was the decision made of what was going to be put in?
The Hebrew Bible is a lot harder to pin that down with, and I say that because with the New Testament you have these church councils. And so there's records of, the Council of Constantinople 310. They are debating, the bishops are all debating the validity of first-hand accounts of different books. And yes, not so sure about these three. These four we're going to jettison. The Hebrew scripture comes together at a slower pace. A lot of it's verbal, and then later, the written copies become part of it. But it's more over the course of a couple, like almost 1,000 years of compiling. You have the Torah, which has always kind of been set. But then the other books, you have this verbal history, but it's not as clear-cut, I think, as you have a meeting and everybody's deciding over the course of a couple of church councils. Let me come back to you with that question, some more research on that, because there's a better answer than the one I've just given you.
Or like when it was a done deal, like when it was finalized or whatever.
Yeah.
You mentioned that maybe the ending was different.
Yes.
Was that widespread expectation, or is that more recent? But that's...
Well, I think, so one of the things that you can discover, and I'll use the book of Mark as an example because it's a little clearer cut, but if you read Mark in your Bibles at home, most of your Bibles will say, it'll either have an asterisk, or then it'll say the shorter ending of Mark, and then it'll say the long ending of Mark, and then before both of those is the rest of Mark and where it ends. So there's really 3 endings. And how do they determine that? Which one's the right one? Well, so when archaeologists are digging around, they discover copies. Let's say there's A, B, and C copies of Mark. And for a long time, we think that C, which is the long ending of Mark, through Mark 16, is Mark's gospel, right? But then somebody just digs something up, and it's there's a Gospel of Mark that doesn't include chapter 16. It's not there. All right, why isn't it there? Are we missing something on the scroll? No, the scroll seems to be totally there, but that chapter that we know is not there. All right, so is this an older version of Mark? Did somebody then later add on to it? And so you compare these different fragments, because a lot of times they're not, they're pieces. And then you discover discover another copy of Mark. You're also kind of carbon dating the other things in the room, stone, different organic material, and carbon dating, what age is it? And so you're trying to determine which of these things is older. You look at other church leaders that are contemporaries of the book, that at the time period it's written, and things that they're saying about the story that they know. So like for Mark's gospel, Clement of the bishop of Antioch was talking about these are the gospels as we know them before they're written. And we have records of the scrolls being discovered. So we know that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are understood, at least by the bishop of Antioch, as gospels as early as 30, 38, 40 AD. So do we have copies of the gospels that are that old? No, but we have somebody saying that they know the stories. But there's not a mention of John until later. So okay, at some point the fourth gospel comes into play, or at least in that part of the world. And again, you got to kind of figure the other pieces out because we don't have internet, right? So at least in one pocket of the world, these are the scriptures we know as our story. And then when you compare those to other places like Alexandria and Jerusalem and Corinth, and then you put those pieces together. What are the different people saying? What are the different sources saying? What are the archaeological evidence? And that's why a discovery like Qumran is so important, because it shows that we have now, out of these Bedouin ruins, these sheep caves, we discover these scrolls that are 900 to 1200 years older than anything we had. And the similarities between what we had and what was there, pretty close, pretty accurate, considering this is word of mouth, writing down in handwritten. So it tells us where the changes are. You get to see things that weren't in those older copies, and then you start to ask questions around them. That's how we try and figure out, like, this ending of Esther between the Greek and Hebrew, what's added. We didn't have the Greek copy, and now we have it, and it's different. So why is it different? And then you get to ask those questions. But all those are really important. When we talk about biblical literalism or inerrancy, I say that context is important, but it's also important that you think about what choices were made to put the book in. What are the books in the original languages? Are there changes? What is changed in the translation to English? Because sometimes the English translation is really bad. Like when we're talking, I'm sorry, I know I'm going on and prattling, but when we're talking about Peter walking on water, and our English books say, "It is I." And Jesus said, "Hey guys, it is I." But the Greek reads, "I am." That's it. That's all it reads. What is I am? It's the name of God in the Greek Bible. So it's a whole lot different than Jesus saying, "Hey guys, it's me, Jesus, I'm out on the water," versus God is here. You ask who I am God. That's a mountain apart, right? That changes the whole meaning of the text. Or when Judas is in the garden and he kisses Jesus, and it says, "Judas, do you betray me with a kiss?" And the English translates it as a question mark. But it's quite possible that that's a statement. You're my friend. You betrayed me with a kiss. It could be the punctuation's not there. So you've made a choice in how you're reading it as a question, but it doesn't have to read that way. It might not read that way. We weren't in the garden. We don't know. But anyway, things to consider when we're really exploring what the Bible actually says and how we interpret it as a community. That's it. That's what we got for Esther. I hope you've enjoyed Esther. I'm sorry if I carried on too much again. I'd rather have you talk more than me. Next week is Job. Great book. Great book. It's a deep book. Friends aren't very helpful. You can ask yourself what that means in the story. There's a lot of questions about how God is portrayed, how Satan is portrayed.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Is this the first time we've read the word Satan in the Bible?
Yes. Yes, it is. It is the first time we've read the word Satan in the Bible. And I'd like...
It's not,
In Job.
And do.
no, I mean,
So the garden is interpreted as Satan, and one of the New Testament writers
says,
calls him that ancient serpent. But the writer of Genesis never says it's Satan. The fact that the serpent is testing or tempting Adam and Eve makes that link. But I would argue it's right for us to wonder, because the same way that Pope Gregory IX made the connection that Mary Magdalene was the same one who was the woman who anointed Jesus with oil, and in the other text was the sinful woman that the Pharisees didn't want touching Jesus' feet, and thereby Mary Magdalene was a prostitute, even though the Bible doesn't say she was a prostitute anywhere, it just says she was possessed by 7 demons, but we linked one text to the other. But so, yeah, we always talk about the snake being Satan, but that's not what that text says necessarily. But I would like you to think about a couple things as you're reading, just kind of a primer for Job. So Satan, the understanding of what Satan is different than you'll get later in the New Testament. And I'm going to leave it at that. Think about, try to cast aside all the things you know about the devil, or pointy pitchfork and red and forked tongue or tail, and think about only what Job says about Satan. Okay? How is the writer of Job, what is Satan to the writer of Job? Because it's going to be very different than what Satan is to the writer of Revelation or Luke. And so I ask you that because, are we talking about evil, or are we talking about something else in Job in terms of Satan? And you'll, I hope, see what I mean, or you can ask questions about, ask Pastor Michelle about it. I won't be here. You can throw her those calls. The other thing I want you to consider is that, so it's kind of like two old guys playing checkers, is what I say sometimes. God's kind of has a bet with Satan in the book of Job. I bet you if you let me mess with Job, he'll renounce his faith. He'll act like he never had a relationship with you. God says, I don't think so. I'll take that bet. You're going to regret it because I'm the best there's ever been. But anyway, perhaps one of the morals of the book of Job to consider is that I had never thought about before, but I'm just going to share this because I won't be here with you next week, that God believes in the best of human beings always. Humans' potential for the greatest good. Whereas Satan, the Satan character says, nah, you push them a little, they'll fold like a house of cards every time. So I would ask you to wrestle with the nature of the character of God. Not God as taking a bet, but God's belief in humanity as something to think about from the book of Job, in addition to suffering and fairness and justice. Okay? Have a great week with reading Job.